For many of us, particularly if you are, my age or older, Ben Kinchlow is not somebody that is a newcomer on the scene. You probably, like me, growing up in my household, turning on the television, watching the 700 Club as I grew up. It was a great connection, as even Eric Wallace talked about last night, with seeing someone on that screen that looked like us. And I know that my family have been long supporters of the 700 Club, not just because of Dr. Pat Robertson, but also because of the man that's going to speak to you today. He's a minister, broadcaster, author, and businessman. Ben Kinchlow is known throughout the world as the longtime co-host of the 700 Club and the international, as well as the international edition of the 700 Club, which was seen in more than 80 countries. Ben Kinchlow has served 13 years in the Air Force, was a recipient of the American Legion Award of Merit, earned a degree in business administration, and later actually began to direct a drug and alcohol rehabilitation program at Christian Farms in Killeen, Texas. He's an ordained minister from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which he obtained in 1971. And at that time, he said that he found his place in ministry, ministering to teens. Mr. Kinchlow founded the Americans for Israel, an organization dedicated to promoting a mutual understanding of the ancient bond between Christians and Jews. He also serves as the co-host of the Front Page Journalism radio show, a comprehensive news and commentary program featuring top newsmakers in the United States and in Israel. Mr. Kinchlow is a commentary contributor with WorldNet Daily, a widely distributed conservative internet newspaper with an emphasis on aggressive investigative reporting. If any of you are familiar with WorldNet Daily, you would know that. He's a member of Phi Theta Kappa, also serves on the board of the National Council on Biblical Curriculum in Public Schools. Mr. Kinchlow is the author of several books, including Plain Bread. Also, You Don't Have to If You Don't Want to. Are these books here, Dr. Kinchlow? Okay, so you have to, he'll tell us how you can get those if you desire to get those. But he's going to come to us today, and he's going to talk about a very unique topic, which I'll let him talk about, but it's listed here in the program as Black Yellow Dog. So please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Ben Kinchlow.
Good morning. With an invitation, with an introduction like that, I was wondering who he was talking about after about the first 30 seconds, and I thought I was supposed to be next. Well, one thing I learned early on, right away this morning, and some of you probably shared this same revelation that I had this morning. One of the things that I discovered this morning, so you can just turn to the person and share with them the same thing I discovered. Just turn to them and say, "Man, morning come early up here, doesn't it?" I am not going to take a lot of your time up, but I'm sure you heard about this. You heard about the American archaeologist in the USA who found copper wire while he was excavating an earlier 20th century excavation site. And he came to the conclusion that America had had an advanced telecommunications system about a century ago. There was another archaeologist, however, from China who was looking out for the Chinese culture, who was working on an excavation at the early 19th century site. He dug down 20 feet and he found copper wire and came back and published his conclusions that the Chinese had had an advanced telecommunication network 2 centuries ago. Well, not to be outdone, Malik Jones, who was a black activist from Chicago, took off for Africa. He went to a village and conducted his own investigation, and after he dug down for 30 feet, he found nothing. So he came back and published his report that 300 years ago, blacks had already gone wireless. So if you don't mind, I'm just going over and have a little seat, and we're just going to share this thing with you and me. Instead of me preaching, right, we're just going to sit here and have just a brief little chat here, so you'll forgive me. But one of the things you discover is sometimes when people don't have the actual facts, they will accept what is presented as factual, whether or not it's true. And if necessary, they will alter the facts to suit a given viewpoint. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the old phrase, what you don't know won't hurt you, but we all know now that's not true. Just turn to somebody and say, that ain't the truth, baby. what you don't know can cause you to make some mistakes that can prove extremely detrimental to your future well-being. So I want to spend just a few minutes this morning talking about politics. Just turn to somebody and say amen for just a few minutes. Now, I don't want to talk just politics. I want to talk facts. Now, the Bible says when you know the truth shall make you free. The Bible also says, render to Caesar that which is Caesar, and to God that which is God. In other words, it contained in that phrase is how we relate not only to God, but to the government under which we serve. And we need to be aware of the kind of government under which we serve, which is a republic. It's not a democracy, it's a republic. And we need to understand the significant difference between a democracy and a republic. When you know what the truth is, you can make informed, intelligent decisions based on facts, not fiction. Because one of the hosts of the 700 Club, it was part of my responsibility to ensure that the stories we put on the air were factual, true, not something somebody made up. We had researchers who verified the claims of people who said we had a miracle happen to us. We verified that before we put it on the air. So now after 20 or so years of doing this, I formed a habit of getting the facts of the matter before making a final decision on anything, especially political things. So consequently, as I was doing the research for my latest book, which is coming out in a couple of days, Black Yellow Dogs, I had a real insight when I came up with this quote from Edward Hale, who was a former chaplain of the United States Senate. When he was asked, as chaplain of the Senate, do you pray for the senators? He quickly replied, after getting to know the senators, I pray for the people. So let me thank you all for coming. I know we got a busy day ahead, so let's just cut to the chase. When I was a child, my mother was my teacher, and I told my mother a joke once. I heard about books and black people. The joke went, when the white man wants to keep something hidden from black folks, he puts it in the book because he knows the Negro ain't going to pick up no book. Now, Mama, who was a teacher with a master's degree, which she earned, by the way, teaching in the winter and attending summer school, didn't think that joke was funny. And hopefully, most blacks today will not think it's funny either, because I hope they will be, in fact, some of them incensed enough that they possibly, in an attempt to prove me wrong, will go find out the truth for themselves. It's extremely difficult to make intelligent decisions and sound judgment when one is without the facts. Uninformed, as I was making decisions and reaching conclusions on what I thought were the facts of the matter. I was to learn later that I didn't have all the facts, and I want you to know it's dangerous to make life choices with only partial information. For example, doing my research, I learned that the first blacks to arrive in America were not slaves. Just like many Europeans, they came as indentured servants. Indentured servants worked for a specified period of time, and after the time was over, they were given freedom, citizenship, and 50 acres of land. The power of the people they indentured themselves to was limited, and a skill had to be taught to the indentured person. And listen to this. Even after slavery became a reality, all blacks in America were not slaves. In fact, how's this for statistics? Over 10,000 free blacks lived in New Orleans, Louisiana. And of those 10,000 blacks who lived in New Orleans, Louisiana, over 3,000 of them owned over 12,000 black slaves. Now, these slave owners, of course, were mostly quadroons and octoroons and, very light-skinned Negroes, which brings up a very interesting question. When you talk about reparations, I got a question for you. Do light-skinned Negroes owe reparations to dark-skinned Negroes for slavery? Just turn to somebody and say, But if you really want some information to shock me, you've got to read my book, Black Yellow Dogs. Because there, doing the research, I learned something that really blew me away. I learned about the origins of legalized slavery in America. And when I found this out, I had to tell you, I could not believe it. I had to go back to a ruling all the way back in 1654 by the Court of Northampton, Virginia. And when I read that in the original language, I was flabbergasted, totally blown away, when I discovered who the father of slavery in America really is. And if you want to know, you have to find my book and get it. But let me just tell you, it's not what most of us have been led to believe. And when you find this out, you'll be shocked, and I might tell you at the end of this thing. But anyway, why did you write the book, Kinchlow? I wrote the book to challenge the status quo, to cause people, especially us black folks, to think objectively about ourselves and about American history. But why did you choose the title Black Yellow Dogs? Are you calling black people dogs? Obviously not. So let me just tell you about that. In 1928, in the presidential elections there, the senior senator, a Democrat from Alabama, Tom Eflin, decided he was not going to support the Democrat candidate for governor, who was New York Governor Al Smith. He was running for president against Herbert Hoover. So this senior Democrat senator decided he and other party members were going to support the Republican. Now, many hardline, rank-and-file Southern Democrats were outraged because despite the fact that this was Alabama, that these were deep South Protestants, and Smith was a Yankee Catholic, these dogged party loyalists were inflexible. They would support Smith. When Heflin asked them why they would support a Yankee Catholic, the leader of the hardliners replied, quote, "I'd vote for a yellow dog if he ran on the Democrat ticket." The press picked it up, and the phrase yellow dog Democrat has become a part of the American political lexicon. A yellow dog Democrat is someone who, no matter the issue, no matter the candidates, he votes Democrat, period. Unfortunately, many blacks are yellow dog Democrats. And as a black who habitually voted Democrat, when I did vote, I qualified as a black yellow dog. However, facts are dangerous things, because once I became aware of certain historical facts, I began to question the flawed concept of voting in blind faith for any party or any candidate. Facts matter. In 2000, at the Democrat Shadow Convention in Los Angeles, Jesse Jackson made this statement. There was a lot of talk a few weeks ago at the Republican National Convention about the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. In that Constitution, African Americans were considered 3/5 of a human being. Now, many people have accepted that as being the facts of the matter. Problem is, it's not true. For the full story, I can't give you the full story, but let me just cut to the short version of it. Representatives in Congress, as you know, are determined by population. The more people a state has, the more representatives, not senators, but the more representatives they get. So for population purposes, the South wanted to count slaves as people. So the North said, okay, you free them, give them the right to vote, and we'll count them. The South said, no, blacks are property. So the North said, fine. If you can count your property, I'm going to count mine. You count a slave, I'm going to count a horse. You count a slave, I'm going to count a cow. Well, the South said, no, that's not going to work. And if you try that, we will not join the Union, and the United States Union would have failed. So they came up with a compromise. That's why it's called the 3/5 compromise. The North agreed to count every 5 slaves as 3. Thus, 60% of the population, or 3/5 of the slave population, would be counted for representational purposes. Had nothing to do with the value of a human being. Amen. Just turn to somebody and say amen. So as I become more familiar with the facts, I came up with some questions. Why are African Americans essentially in the pocket of the Democrat machine? Why, or what are the facts regarding blacks, Republicans, and Democrats? Why do blacks almost in lockstep support a political party they disagree with on several moral or social issues? So we often, unfortunately, a lot of us just turn to somebody and say, he ain't talking about me. But oftentimes people look to the so-called civil rights leaders and spokesmen for direction. Question, could there be a problem? Because it seems that we have ignored an ancient warning that could easily be applied to many of our African-American, quote, civil rights leaders. Quote, beware, there are blind guides, and if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into a pit. So it's my fond hope that indeed these leaders are merely blind guides, for I shudder to think that they are doing this deliberately to lead blacks down the primrose path. Because you see, it turns out that Republicans support many of the same positions embraced by blacks. And by the way, let somebody misunderstand, I'm not here as a representative of the Republican Party. I'm here to give you the facts. For instance, several polls, the majority of African Americans support school prayer, education vouchers will let you send your kid where you want to, faith-based initiatives, and the death penalty. Democrats oppose every one of those. On the other hand, a lot of blacks oppose same-sex marriage and race-based preferences. They don't think that your opportunities should be based on your race. Most blacks who attend church regularly also say abortion should be illegal. Even a lot of those who don't go say that's the truth. So more African Americans oppose legalizing homosexual marriage than the general population. For your information, I'm sure you knew this, the Democrats support every single one of those policies. So clearly, Democrats and blacks are on different pages when it comes to basic moral values. In other words, blacks embrace Republican values, but they vote Democrat. Some blacks. Just turn to the guy sitting next to us. He ain't talking about me again. So who are these rich, white, racist slobs, the Republicans? Well, in 1820, there was a group of Andrew Jackson supporters. They called themselves Democratic Republicans. But in 1820, they dropped the Republican and became Democrats. Later on, in 1854, specifically in response to the spread of slavery into the new territories, a group of citizens in Wisconsin who still called themselves Democratic Republicans formed a new political party at their state convention in Jackson, Michigan. They dropped Democratic and they formally adopted their new name, Republicans. The Republican Party was founded squarely and specifically on the opposition to slavery. Of the 17 planks in their platform, 7 directly or indirectly call for the abolition of slavery. And who was their first presidential candidate? Anybody remember a man called President Abraham Lincoln? Maybe like me, many African Americans didn't know that the first 7 blacks in the U.S. Congress, Senate and House, were all Republicans, or that the first black to preside over a Senate session received 11 votes for vice president in the Republican convention in 1888. Moving forward a little bit, just for your information, 3 African Americans have presided over the Republican National Convention, 0 at the Democrat National Convention. And another interesting statistic, in 1976, over 85% of blacks voted Democrat. In 1876, 99% of blacks voted Republican. Why? Because in 1876, only Republicans allowed blacks to vote. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment, as you know, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to blacks, and the 15th Amendment granted voting rights to black men. All of these were introduced and passed by Republicans. They were all vigorously opposed by Democrats. And listen to this, quote, "Be it enacted that all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theater, and other places of public amusement, and these provisions are applicable alike to citizens of every race, every color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. Does that sound encouraging? Well, that was from a civil rights bill passed by the Republicans in 1875. In addition, there were civil rights acts introduced in 1866, which not only guaranteed those civil rights, but it gave federal courts the judicial authority to enforce them. Also, civil rights bills were introduced in 1865, 1870, 1871, and each one would have granted equality and civil rights to all African Americans. I have a question for you. How different do you think life would have been in America had the Democrats supported even one of those civil rights bills? Would it have made a difference in how we live? But it was not to be. The Civil War, after the Civil War, the Democrats and their so-called Redeemer state governments and a powerful political bloc at the national level. And you know how they got that powerful political bloc? Remember the Three-Fifths Clause? This gave them additional representation in Congress, and aided by filibusters and a packed Supreme Court, they ensured that no civil rights legislation would be passed from 1877 to 1954. Historical records and documented research shows that the Democrat Party blocked every anti-lynch law and perpetrated every anti-black pro-segregation initiative from 1860 to 1960. Every civil rights bill up to and including the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, were all passed by a Republican majority over the objections and filibusters of the Democrats. You, of course, will remember that it was President Eisenhower, a Republican, who sent federal troops to remove a Democrat governor, Orville Forbes, who was literally blocking the door to keep 8 little black children from going to Little Rock High School. And of course, all of us remember those famous words from Democrat Governor George Wallace: segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, or some people are thinking. But Ben, the Democrats passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And they integrated the armed forces, didn't they? No. In both cases, the Democrat president was forced to sign the legislation after the Republican majority carried it. For example, it was 80-60 for the Civil Rights Act, 95-75 for the Voting Rights Act, Republicans over Democrats. And integrated the military. Let me tell you why President Truman signed that. Blacks threatened civil disobedience. Here was the option that American politicians faced from American blacks. They said, you'll have to put us in jail. We are not going to be drafted and go off to fight and die to obtain civil rights for other people that we don't have at home. Guess what? The Democrat president signed the bill. Wasn't that marvelous of him? He had to desegregate the military. Let me give you just one more egregious example. This is why President Lyndon Johnson, who most of us are familiar with, a Democrat, signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which, by the way, was a watered-down version of a Republican Civil Rights Act in 1957, which did not pass because the Democrats killed it. And that itself was just an update of the 1865 Republican Civil Rights Act that I told you about. Why did this happen? Because in 1960, some of you remember, blacks took to the streets. Demonstrations that included Jews, whites, blacks had America glued to their news sources. Something had to be done. And let me remind you that the Democrats, via the state governments, a sympathetic Supreme Court, and congressional help, had blocked or killed all civil rights legislation that tried to be passed from 1874 to 1954. Because of the 3/5 clause, they regained control of Congress. So, when he was a senator, LBJ observed, quote, "These Negroes, they're getting pretty uppity these days, and that's a problem for us Democrats, since they've got something now they never had before, the political pull to back up their uppityness. So we got to give them a little something to settle them down." So why did LBJ make such a big deal of signing the 1964 Civil Rights Acts for these uppity Negroes? Well, remember, it was a Republican majority in Congress that passed it into law. But Johnson, who was a consummate politician, saw this as a political plum just right for the picking. He knew, and the Democrats felt, this could change black voting patterns for the foreseeable future. And they knew it. Let me give you some proof. And I'm going to quote here from a book called Inside the White House, published in 1995 by Simon & Schuster and written by a man named Ronald Kessler. Flying on Air Force One, President Johnson said this to two Southern governors, and I quote, "I'll have those niggers voting Democrat for the next 200 years," close quote. Today, Democrats and liberals try to assign the blame to slavery and pass off the idea that blacks are stupid, incapable of providing for themselves and their families. Let me just tell you something. In our classrooms, when I went to school, and this will date me, but in our classrooms, we had 4 classes in one room. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th in one room, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th in the next room. And each one of those had one teacher that handled all 4 of those grades. And no time, at not one moment, were black children taught that we were objects of pity, disadvantage, or underprivileged. Yes, we knew about slavery. We learned about it from the old folks. In fact, some of our great families had slavery. My great-grandfather, Ben Kinchlow, was born a slave. But if you ask any successful black entrepreneur, business owner over 65, you'll find we got precious little support from our elders for any concept of being deprived by virtue of being black. Black was not an excuse. Slavery was not an excuse or justification for failure. Back then, black folks' version of affirmative action was rude hog or die. And by the way, let me just say a brief word about affirmative action. Affirmative action is in reality the liberals' 21st century version of 20th century racial profiling. You know why many of us, my age, went to, quote, separate but equal schools, segregated schools? Well, let me tell you why. Because the liberals, the people who were, quote, on our side, said, colored children cannot be expected to intellectually keep up with white children. That's what they said. So they gave us separate but equal schools because they knew we couldn't keep up. You know what affirmative action says? You can't really expect African American students to keep up intellectually with white students. They need help. Lower the standards for blacks. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Well, the truth of the matter is we have oftentimes taken advantage of educational opportunities and much of whatever else we may not have done. But back in the day, no one taught me, and I didn't know anyone who taught us that we were the government's responsibility. Relief, which they today call modern welfare, was spoken of in whispers. Shh, not in front of the children. Belief was not a right. It was a disgrace to be gotten off of as soon as humanly possible. Black pride wasn't about afros, dashikis, and boys wearing plaits. Oh, I'm sorry. They're braids, right? It was about the girl who didn't get pregnant out of wedlock, but finished school, and the boy who got a degree or a steady job and supported the girl he married, not got pregnant and abandoned. I want to make this as clear as I possibly can. Black people are not born wards of the state. Our mental capacities are not underdeveloped because of something that happened to our ancestors over 200 years ago. Now, there have been tens of millions of words and countless scholarly works have been written about we were one time Negroes, colored, Negro, Afro, black, and now we're African Americans. So let's turn to somebody and say, who are you anyway? Let me just tell you. They wrote millions of words about our condition before and after. What few intelligent people would deny was an egregious stain on the fabric of the American experiment, slavery. And this one little speech should not be misconstrued as exhaustive in any sense of the term. It is merely one man's attempt, as Supreme Court Clarence Thomas said, quote, to assert my right to think for myself, to refuse to have my ideas assigned to me as though I was an intellectual slave. Following Mama's advice and reading, I've been shocked, dismayed, enlightened, and encouraged by what I read. And I want to challenge all of you who may disagree with what you heard today to do your own research. Get the historical facts. Arrive at your own conclusions. Don't let me or anybody else make decisions for you. And despite the Democrats' best efforts from the 1800s to the 1960s to prevent it, times have changed dramatically. And this convention that you're at is just one more tiny bit of evidence. This is not a colored hotel. How many of you remember traveling years ago when you had to try to find a colored motel? I do. Traveled across the country, we had to find the colored section where we could find a colored restaurant and a colored motel. This is not a colored hotel. We didn't eat this morning in a colored dining room. And I challenge anyone to find a concrete example of what used to be just the way it was. When's the last time you saw a black man step off the sidewalk until a white woman passed by? How many of you ever drank from a colored water fountain, visited a colored restroom, waited in a colored waiting room, ate at a colored lunch counter, or even buried your fellows in a colored cemetery? Well, Ben, somebody said, why are you bringing all this stuff up? I'll tell you why. Are you saying there are no races in America? No, I'm not saying that. There are races in America, white and black. But I want people to know, to understand what real racism, prejudice, and discrimination is, not the stuff that we see today, which I call virtual racism. You see, I drank from those colored water fountains. I even sneaked a sip from the white water fountain. By the way, the water tastes the same. I used those colored waiting rooms and the lunch counters and searched for colored hotels when I traveled. I buried my grandfather in a colored cemetery. And when I came to the 700 Club a few years ago, we had counselors on our telephones. And one of the counselors was a lay preacher who believed in segregation. And I remember I was going out the door, and some people stopped him, and they said, Brother Ben, I want you to be so-and-so. How do you do? And they said, Brother so-and-so believes in segregation. And Brother so-and-so looked at me right now and said, yes, I believe in segregation. So somebody asked him, so, well, Braden, Brother so-and-so, don't you believe that Brother Ben is saved? Don't you believe Brother Ben's going to heaven? And he looked him right in the eye and said, yes, but it won't be a problem then because we'll all be washed whiter than snow. True story. So not only am I no longer required to eat at segregated lunch counters, but I've been invited to and sat down for lunch with two presidents at the White House. They just both happen to be Republicans, and both of them knew who I was. I have to confess, I've not been invited to lunch by our current president, and I probably won't get invited to do. But as someone who lived through the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, I have seen the extraordinary progress made by America for all Americans. And I know that blacks are not hypocrites or stupid, but many, like I, was uninformed about some of the key elements contributing to the current state of affairs in America. And let me just tell you, I had the privilege of serving in the United States Air Force for over a decade. I spent time in Europe, the Caribbean, Central and South America. I spent time in the Middle East and Africa. And I saw the best and the worst of all those places. America 2013 is not a perfect place. But there are no perfect places. And there is a reason why there are no perfect places. There are no perfect places because there are no perfect people. But let me speak from the perspective of someone who's, as we say, been there, done that. Seen the best, seen the worst. Ate with Saudi princesses and in villages where they ate out of bowls with their fingers. I can tell you that in my opinion, to which I am still entitled, America is not perfect. But in 2013, America comes as close as any nation on earth. And if you've never been anywhere but the United States, you don't know what I'm talking about. But I can say that America in 2013 comes as close as any nation on earth to truly being the land of the free. And so I say without reservation, wherever and whenever, God bless America. Thank you.